Okay, so everybody, thank you for your contribution for this campaign that we had. Okay, and I'm very happy and grateful that we have Dr. Jackie Stone today here with us. I gave her a very short notice and she managed to come. So thank you and welcome to Singapore again for our event, Dr. Jackie Stone. Okay, can I ask you to unmute yourself? Okay, sorry. Dr. Jackie Stone, can you unmute yourself?
Oh, that's better. Can you hear me now?
Yes. Thank you.
No problem.
Yes, so I understand, guys, I think you may have seen her interview. Okay, there was a video that I shared today. So she herself is fighting the authorities on the ivermectin issue in South Africa, but she was so kind to also prepare the affidavit for us. So I'm just going to share a little screen, and it's the excerpt of the thing that you have prepared for us so that everybody's on the same page. Let me just bring it up. Hold on. Okay, give me a minute. Okay. So what we've done is that we have actually prepared something like this for those who wanted to have some information. So this is prepared by Dr. Jackie Stone for us. And she had some responses to Ong Ye Kong's defense and so forth. And you saw the evidence by the AGC. Okay, and I think you mentioned something about it's like modeling and it's not, there's conflict of interest. Would you be able to maybe just tell us a little bit about what your own, like what you learned in the whole preparation of this?
Okay. I think the first thing to say, Iris, is that we don't have mRNA vaccines in Zimbabwe. Oh. We only have Sinovac and Sinopharm. We do have an issue where sometimes Ministry of Health go into schools and vaccinate children without their consent. And that is clearly a legal issue rather than a medical issue, because informed consent is essential for a child to be vaccinated. We obviously have looked quite significantly at the issues of whether vaccination in children is required or not. And one of our more extreme doctors has basically said, since when do we vaccinate children to protect the elderly? And that doctor is a Muslim, and they basically said it's a bit like using children as a human shield. And I think that although that's a very extreme option, a very extreme vision, it does bring out the fact that what is the point of vaccination? Who are we trying to protect? And how severe is the problem? I think the other thing to mention in Zimbabwe in particular is that we have 1.4 million people who have got HIV. We have 135,000 malaria cases every year. COVID at the moment has killed just over 5,000 people. It's no big deal in the infectious disease scheme of things in Zimbabwe. And I think possibly because we come from a low middle income country where we are used to people with severe infectious disease, our attitude towards it is not, oh my goodness, we're all going to die. It's a case of this is another infectious disease managed early. My speciality is combination therapy used early. And why would you get into such a panic? And why would you spend all that money on vaccinating children in particular who aren't going to die from it anyway, when those resources could be put into things like HIV and malaria? So we come into it in quite a different context, because I think having been to Singapore, you are infinitely more first world than where I live. So getting back to the rationale behind vaccinating children, the first question is the child going to die from the disease? And in our experience here, particularly with Omicron, children have couple of days of illness and it's over. It really, even if they do get tested, which I'd rather they didn't, because otherwise they can't go to school for a week. You know, we know that the research shows that children do not transmit. We know that the research shows that if children die, it's probably 1 in 45 to 56 million kids that will die from it. So my training is aviation medicine. I know Singapore Airlines has been Airline of the Year many times. The airline I used to work for used to share the same luxury, but it kind of got a bit too big. And when you look at a risk-benefit analysis, risk equals probability times consequences. So what is the risk of doing nothing with children? And the risk is basically the probability that they're going to die is as close to zero as any doctor is going to say. So the consequences of death or disability from COVID itself are absolutely negligible. What is the risk of giving an mRNA vaccine to anyone, including a child? Let's just take myocarditis, because I think the data is cleaner on that. What is the risk? And I'm in a situation where my son is about to return to university in Australia, and I'm having to make a decision as to whether I'm happy that he has an mRNA vaccine to enter the University of Queensland. He is 20 years old. He is an exceptionally good rugby player. And the main reason he wants to go to the University of Queensland is not to do engineering, it's to play rugby, although he would never tell me that. But I know that his sporting career is far more important to him than anything else. Otherwise, there would be other universities he might have chosen. The risk is reported as between 1 in 1,000 to 1 in 55,000. But I don't really care what the probability is, because the consequence of myocarditis and myocardial damage in a 20-year-old, otherwise extremely fit young man is that his rugby career is over and then he might die. So irrespective of what the probability is, the risk is still significant. So to vaccinate, I am causing a significant risk. And to not vaccinate, there is no risk. Therefore, for me, the conclusion is clear. Okay. Now, what people will come and say to me is, oh, you're irresponsible because your son's going to go and transmit COVID-19 to his elderly grandparents. Well, in actual fact, I think it's very, very clear now that the vaccines do not prevent transmission. So the statement that was used, which is when children are vaccinated, families will be protected, is now untrue. I am not sure whether it was definitively untrue at the time that it was made, but it should be taken down now, because children will go and have themselves vaccinated in order to protect the people they love, when in actual fact, they are more likely to transmit once they've been vaccinated, and they are actually at higher risk. Yeah. So I'm eliminating that completely, which is the second statement. When children are vaccinated, families will be protected. The first statement, where vaccines are safe and effective, well, safe means that they're harm-free, effective means that they work. And that point could be argued for 4 days among a group of intellectual doctors. I don't look at the term safe and effective. I look at a risk-benefit analysis. What is the risk of not vaccinating? What is the risk of vaccinating? And for the individual child, why would you give a substance that is of no benefit to them, even if the risk is 1 in 55,000 of them dropping dead or never being able to play sport again? Because if it's your child they are 100% dead. And when I'm looking at my own son, I would rather delay his university return than have him vaccinated, no matter how low the risk. And I'd equate it to an aeroplane carrying, A380 carrying 500 people in the back. We do very specific risk calculations when we decide to license a pilot, for example, who's had a heart attack and who needs a stent. The pilot is stented, when can he go back to fly? And we do a calculation which says that when his risk of sudden or subtle incapacitation is less than 1% per year, it is worth putting the people in the back at risk. So the probability that he's going to have another heart attack is virtually zero. But we do not take that risk if the consequences are that 500 people on board could die. And I think we need to be developing this mentality. And I also think we've got to try and there's been a lot of hysterical language that has surrounded a lot of this. There's been a lot of emotion. And when emotion kicks in, a lot of people switch off. And we need to be discussing this calmly and sensibly. Does the risk outweigh the benefit, or does the risk not outweigh the benefit? Yes, if we get into it further. I mean, I say to a lot of patients who ask me, do I think the vaccine is safe? My honest answer is, I have no idea. Partly because we don't have mRNA vaccines here, partly because I don't think you can believe any data that's out there. After the Together trial that came out in the New England Journal of Medicine, that has 43 flaws, and the mortality data actually shows a 60% reduction in mortality. Yet the press report that ivermectin, honestly, unless I see it with my own eyes, or unless it comes from a doctor who I know has no conflict of interest, I'm not interested in what the science says, because science has been manipulated, and there are lies, damn lies, and then there are statistics. So I think what we need to be doing is going back to common sense, logic, and staying away from being very emotional, because when you get emotional, you're seen as crazy fringe. You give the opposition ammunition. So the very simple answer is, are the vaccines safe? Well, I will give you that opinion when I see the 5 to 15-year safety data. Because anybody who tells you that they are safe or dangerous doesn't have enough information. So the answer is unknown. And anybody who says the vaccines are safe, including our Sinopharm vaccines, is not telling the truth, because nobody does know, because the data is not yet out.
Yeah.
So that's been my take on it the whole way. From my point of view, living in a low middle income country, first of all, at least 65% and probably 80% of our population have herd immunity to Omicron. So the most important thing to do is to establish immunity or not. The second thing is, if we find that someone vulnerable is not immune, then the thing that we would do in our part of the world is give them a treatment pack, which would include ivermectin, doxy, zinc, hydroxychloroquine. We used a nebulized solution as well. And so we see 99.99% survival when this disease is treated in the first 3 days. So basically, it is the option of the vulnerable to make an informed choice about whether or not they want to be vaccinated. And that is the group that could be offered the vaccine, because there is some evidence that the mRNA vaccines in the elderly may reduce mortality. We're not saying that they're all disastrous and bad. There is no logic at all, given that children do not die of this disease, and particularly during Omicron, to give mRNA vaccines to children until we actually know what the risks really are. So I don't know if that's helpful for you.
No, it's very, very helpful. Thank you so much, Dr. Jackie. And I think you are also fighting, they are also trying to roll out some vaccination for children in South Africa. Is that right? Is that
So one of the things just to point out is that South Africa and Zimbabwe are two totally different places. Okay. It's a bit like when you tell a Canadian they're American, they go, no, I'm not. Okay. So South Africa has been, their political system is such that their government are certainly supporting mRNA vaccines. They have made the prescription of ivermectin illegal / so difficult it's almost impossible to get it. And they are severely persecuting the doctors who actually used it. Our situation in Zimbabwe is very different. We started using ivermectin well before vaccines. We knew it worked for prevention. We knew it worked for treatment. And when the vaccines came along, I was the person pushing ivermectin. And I think that there was an incentive to stop ivermectin because if early treatment works, the vaccines have to go back into clinical trials because they're still under emergency use authorization. So the target on me, I have to say, was not from our government. Our government on the 26th of January 2021 stated that while it is the job of the Ministry of Health to protect the public, they cannot deny them effective, safe treatment strategies. And from then, Zimbabwe became one of the biggest importers of ivermectin in the world. So our government have been fully supportive of this. The person that reported me to the medical council was a British doctor who has very strong ties with the Wellcome Trust. And I think from what you've said, that in Singapore, you also have people who have very strong ties with so-called charity associations that have very strong financial interests in pushing the vaccine schedule. So I was reported to the police on the 19th of January last year when I was using ivermectin before our Minister of Health and our Permanent Secretary of Health had approved its importation. And the trial procedure I'm going through now is because once you've laid a criminal charge, it has to be played out in court. And I've also chosen to continue with court proceedings because with some of the people I've treated and with various angles, I could get the case dropped. But then everybody will say, oh, it's because she's connected. Okay. I want to go to trial. I want to prove that ivermectin is not an animal medication. It is a highly effective medication when used in combination. It works as treatment, and that needs to be a precedent in a court of law. So the persecution of myself seems to have come from very specifically British doctors who are funded to be in this country and who have reported me through our medical council. And our medical council are the people who are persecuting us. So it's actually doctors attacking doctors. And I think one of the other things that we've learned is that medicine is both a science and an art. And those that practice the art of medicine follow the oath. They are interested in saving lives. They are interested in innovation. Those doctors will do what is required to save a patient's life and to protect their patients. But everywhere in the world, there are corrupt people, and you only need two. And in Zimbabwe, there's actually probably three. And those three people have been bought, for want of a better word, because they're in positions of power and they are promoting what the big pharmaceutical companies or outside governments want them to promote. And we know one thing about Africa, and that is we're the continent that has most of the world's mineral reserves. In fact, Zimbabwe has more minerals under its soil than any other country in the world per square kilometer. So we clearly have an enormous amount of interest, because people who convince us that we need their help, which includes their vaccines and their new patented drugs and their health policies. And the interesting thing is our stats are 10 times better than theirs. So I don't know why they think we want to do what they're doing. But they're trying to impose this no one's safe till everyone's safe. And they're going to set up big RNA vaccine factories in South Africa. And the whole of Africa is going to be donated mRNA vaccines that we really don't want. Thank you very much. But that's what we've got to do as Africa, and I don't know how this would relate to Singapore, but in Africa, we're starting to stand up and say, actually, we've got enormous mineral wealth, which is what you want. You're trying to convince us that we're useless so that we have to rely on you. If we borrow money from you and we can't pay it back, what is going to happen? Well, you're going to take what you're already taking, our coal fields, our platinum, our Mapani forests, and everything that you want for your own country's raw materials, because you've already destroyed all of your own. So this whole WHO treaty, the mRNA vaccine thing has become very, very controversial here. And I can tell you right now that I would be very surprised if any Zimbabwean would be happy to take vaccines imposed on them by the WHO or by countries outside of us. So we can't really relate to you 100%, but what I can say is that certainly in Zimbabwe, we cannot understand why you would want to vaccinate children to protect the elderly, because you have to vaccinate at least 10 children for each vulnerable adult. And why would you put those children at risk of vaccine adverse effects when it is going to have no benefit to the child? Children are our future. We don't put them at risk. If anything, an older person would give their life for a child and not vice versa. So that's kind of our logic. And I'm operating much more on logic and common sense than I am on all the data. And one last thing that I would say is that I think that we have to be careful not to keep throwing up graph after graph after graph after graph after graph, proving that vaccines, for example, in athletes, have caused 700 collapses last year. Because I think it's a strategy that is being used by the people who would promote vaccines to completely overload everyone with information to the point where nobody's prepared to even think anymore. Let's get rid of the information overload and let's just look at straight common sense. I don't care whether the risk of myocarditis is 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 55,000. The fact that it will disable or kill my child when the disease will not makes the decision very simple. What they're getting us to do, and even, I mean, I'm trained in this. I've got an honors degree in medical biochem. I've done statistics. I've done all of that sort of thing. I get completely overwhelmed and confused by the data. And yet we're putting that data onto the public to try and interpret. And then everybody gets hysterical, and this person is showing this graph and that person is showing that graph, and actually neither side understands the graph. So we have to recognize, and one thing I've really liked about your concept of heal the divide is we have to recognize that the divide and rule policy has been used in war since time immemorial. And what you need to do if you want to conquer the thinking population is to divide them. So we divide them into vaxxers, anti-vaxxers, ivermectin, anti-ivermectin, right, left. And then if you, President Trudeau, you can be trans, you can be, if you promote ivermectin or you don't want a vaccination, then you are anti-trans, I mean, what it has to do with being racist or trans or gender or whatever is beyond me. They've politicized the whole thing. They whip us all up into a frenzy, when in actual fact, we need to come down and just go, what is the risk-benefit analysis and how does this benefit my child? And stop engaging in the frenetic and frantic flow of information that just pours out. Because I can tell you one thing, I have been very involved in the objections to the Together trial, and we have asked for their data since the 1st of April. Now, I went to court yesterday, and there's an adjournment until the 22nd. The fact that the Together trial stated that ivermectin did not work was going to have a massive impact on the outcome of my hearing, okay? And it was very, very important that I saw the data. And they are still delaying. We need to speak to our statisticians. Our statisticians are busy with another trial, whatever. You have to understand that their strategy will be to postpone indefinitely. Ivermectin on the about the 19th of Jan 2021, we were told it would be 6 weeks before they reanalyzed the data. That was 14 months ago. So the solution is to unite, and unite on the simple things. Stop arguing the trivial, what's the p-value, what's the actual incidence. We know one thing for absolute certain: there is no 5-year safety data. Everybody should be able to agree on that. So everybody agree on one thing and take it calmly and logically to the authorities, and recognize when people are engaging in dividing and ruling the thinking group. So that would be my message to Singapore.
Yes. Thank you so much, Dr. Jackie Stone, for your very assuring message that, the thinking group, and that we really should not allow ourselves to be silenced, and we should not let fear, divide us, and that we should stand united. I think that is a very important message. And thanks for also telling us not to concentrate on the data too much, because it's really just common sense, and nowadays common sense is not very common.
And probably one more thing, Iris, and I think it's bear in mind that I was first detained on the 19th of Jan last year, so I've been in and out of courtrooms and hearings for 14 months now. And one other thing that I have learned is that, apart from the fact that data can be manipulated and people can argue over what is not the issue because of 0.1 decimal place, some ridiculous bit of trivia. But you are also going in to a fight with big pharma, big tech, and some incredibly powerful people. Now, I grew up in a war. You are going in facing nuclear warheads, ground-to-air missiles, and enormous artillery, and you're going in with a handgun and a dagger. And you are going to get shot out of the sky if you take these people on head on. So one of the things we've done in Zimbabwe, whatever my views on vaccination are irrelevant. The point is that I know early treatment works. And when you are going in face on to a full artillery attack, you actually need to start to think differently. And if we go back to Roman days, Rome was actually won with daggers, because there's 7 points in the body that within 2 inches, you can end somebody's life. And anybody who's ever worked in Cape Town, any doctor who's worked in Cape Town will have stitched up all of those places on somebody's body. And the concept of that, although it sounds violent, is that you need to box smart. You cannot take on big pharma and expect to win if you're going in guns blazing, because their guns are bigger. If you look at one of my son's favorite movies, which is Star Wars, you need to go in with a little group of rebels and take out the command center. Because when you put yourself out there and you are seen and labeled as an anti-vaxxer, you will face a lot of opposition. If you go in and say, I'm not really happy about this injection, but here's the treatment pack I want my child to have if they get sick, it's a very different way of approaching it. And I also think that the more that you focus on effective early treatment, if your vaccines are still under EUA there, then, Pierre Corey and Paul Marek have maintained their credibility because what they care is about saving patient lives. The vaccinated and the unvaccinated get sick. How do we treat them? So without saying too much, because I'm quite sure that this call is being watched by people who are not as friendly as you are, I think you just need to think about strategy, about tactics. And I think you need to not engage with what they want you to engage with. So the Together trial, there are 43 different areas that are wrong. And there is one sentence in the whole paper that refers to mortality. And they have miscalculated the data. I would say fraud, incompetence, or both, but then I'd be in trouble. So I'm going to say they have miscalculated the data. They have used the wrong denominator. Is the 43 different errors that are there designed so that all the academics are so busy dealing with all the 43 things that they miss the giant elephant in the room, which is there is a 60% reduction in mortality, even when they've used the wrong doses at the wrong time, okay? So be very aware of being manipulated by governments, by institutions who are basically using behavioral science techniques used in war to divide and rule your population. And what you actually need to do is unite behind one thing. And I think that one thing should just simply be the safety data isn't available yet, because nobody can argue with you on that. They can argue as to what the Pfizer p-value was, or what the incidence of myocarditis is, or whether the serum rhubarb or the load of bollocks virus is involved, okay? They can argue. If you say that something is 1.01 and it's 1.011, it's irrelevant, but people will argue over the tiny stuff. Get away from too much data, start focusing. Do we put children's lives ahead of the elderly to protect them, especially when there is no protection? And is the safety data available yet that warrants the use of an investigational drug in a child? And nobody can say that that data is available yet, because it's not, okay? I can go through all 10 points on the Nuremberg Code where there's a total violation of children's rights by administering this vaccine to them. And all that will happen is they'll get a smart lawyer who will argue back with me. And then 3 months later, we're still arguing and absolutely nothing has happened. Choose what nobody can argue with, and everybody follows that, and you become a much more formidable force.
Yes, very wise indeed. So I think the most important thing I got from your sharing is that how can we say it's safe when you haven't even passed the 5 years, right? That's a safety. How does anybody conclude that it's safe? we don't have the hindsight of time. And that's something that nobody can argue.
And unfortunately, what they're doing is they're taking top academics and top scientific minds and putting them against each other And they're arguing up here when the actual basic issue we all agree on, which is we don't know yet. And therefore, if our children are not dying from this and they're not transmitting it, there is no logical reason to inject them.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so thank you so much, Dr. Jackie Stone, for coming here and for supporting us with our lawsuit. Everybody, please feel free to, just show your support and thanks in the chat box. Okay, and I will definitely be in touch. But you are welcome to stay if you wish, but I'm going to go on to the next part of the...
Now, I've got a patient in 15 minutes, so I've got to go. But great speaking to you, and